It's an incredible honor for us to be able to welcome Dr. Jane Lubchenco today and for me to introduce her. Her current title is University Distinguished Professor and Marine Studies Advisor to the President of Oregon State University. She is a marine ecologist with expertise in the ocean, climate change, and interactions between the environment and human well-being. Shortly after she received her PhD in ecology from Harvard University, she and her husband were recruited to Oregon State in 1977. And they've kind of been there ever since with some interesting side trips. Professor Lubchenco has taught courses in Kingston, Jamaica, also conducted extensive research, Santiago, Chile, Qingdao, China, Christchurch, New Zealand. She took a leave from OSU to serve as administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration from 2009 to 2013. Dr. Lubchenco is one of the most highly cited ecologists in the world. She's won many awards, including 20 honorary doctorates. A MacArthur Genius Fellowship. She was named 2010 Newsmaker of the Year by the science journal Nature. She has numerous other awards recognizing her scientific contributions, her leadership in policy, and her public outreach efforts. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the list gets lots longer. In 2014, she became the first U.S. science envoy for the ocean. In that capacity, she worked closely with leaders in government, civil society, business, and science in China, Indonesia, South Africa, Mauritius, Seychelles, to advance awareness and action about climate change and the ocean. She's a gifted teacher and mentor and has received the Outstanding Teacher Award at OSU. But here's one of the reasons why we're excited to have her here today. She believes and encourages other scientists to believe that scientists have a responsibility to engage with society, to pursue and share knowledge that is relevant to society's most pressing problems, and to exercise that responsibility with transparency, honesty, and humility. After you hear her, you're going to want to read more about her, which is easy to do. So in the meantime, please help me welcome the Honorable Jane Lubchenco.
Well, I'm tethered a little bit here, but not as much as I would be if I was right behind the podium. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. Charles, I'm going to need to get the clicker from you. So first and foremost, thank you for all that you do at the League of Women Voters. I think the real key to a functional democracy is to have informed and engaged citizens. And that's what you are all about. And to delve into issues, to take positions on them that are well informed is incredibly important and a real model for all citizens. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for an opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. Climate change, as someone at our table just said, is the important issue for us today. And if we don't get this right, nothing else is going to matter. There are a lot of challenging issues in society today. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that climate change is really upon us. It's happening now. It's going to get worse. It affects many, many things that we care about. And unless we reduce emissions as fast as possible, we're going to be in for a lot worse. So I'm going to share a few thoughts with you today about what's happening. Let's see if this is going to work. If not, I can do it. Okay. So let me just test something. Can I talk without a microphone and have everybody hear me? Okay, get that. Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Is that going to work? Okay, we'll get this settled. Okay, thank you. So, double click on that one to advance it. Okay, we'll see how this works. Okay, so I'm going to start with the bottom line, which is not too different from what I just articulated, but I really want to emphasize that climate change is not something that is happening someplace far removed from us in the Arctic. It's not someplace, it's not happening sometime way down the road. It's actually happening now. We are already seeing impacts of climate change, and it is likely to get significantly more problematic, affecting both our health, our economy. It affects the ocean. I'm going to spend a little time talking about that more specifically, and indeed our well-being. And time is really running out. It is imperative that we figure out how to come to grips with this. One of the reasons that we are where we are is that there has been a very significant, well-funded campaign of disinformation that has led people to believe either the science was uncertain enough to act, or that addressing climate change would be economically too disruptive. Neither of those is true, and because so many people are now seeing evidence of climate change around them, people are beginning to understand how real the problem is and how serious it is. There are good alternatives that are out there. They are happening very rapidly. I'll talk about that. And the bottom line is that it's now is really the time to act. So can you go back one, please? I got trigger happy here. So what I'm going to do is just give you a sense of where I'm coming from so you understand my perspectives on this. Then I'm going to focus on how climate change is affecting the United States, how it's affecting Oregon, and then how it's affecting the ocean. So those three things in sequence. And then some hopeful signs. I am a marine ecologist. I've studied rocky seashores around the world for decades and have spent many happy hours on the shore doing that. In 2008, President-elect Obama's transition team called and asked on his behalf if I would come run NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and serve as the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere. I ended up saying yes. So I went and spent 4 years in Washington, D.C. NOAA, most of you probably know because it is the parent of the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service is part of NOAA. But NOAA does a lot of other things. It studies climate change. It collects it's the repository, the official repository for all the climate change data for the United States. It's the lead agency among all the different federal agencies for climate science and climate records. So the National Climate Assessment, for example, that is put out every 4 years, mandated by Congress, is led. It's an interagency process, but it's led by NOAA. That's the atmospheric part of NOAA. The oceanographic part of NOAA is that NOAA oversees fisheries in federal waters, and it oversees pretty much anything ocean. It works with states to do coastal zone management, and it is in charge of protecting the trust resources like marine mammals, sea turtles, other things like that. So everything oceanic or atmospheric is part of NOAA. It's about a $6 billion budget and about 13,000 people. It was really a terrific opportunity to lead that organization. As administrator, I got to interact with people not only in the administration, but also all around the country, doing everything from upper left, meeting with fishermen over Oregon Dungeness crab fishing. Here, this was actually in Newport. On the upper left is meeting with fishermen in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, in the immediate aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to talk to them about what we were doing and what we knew. Lower right, I am flying through Tropical Storm Isaac. I also flew through Hurricane Sandy in one of NOAA's Hurricane Hunter planes, because the data that you can take inside a tropical storm or a hurricane is super important to being able to forecast where that storm is going to go, how it's going to behave. And so flying through and taking data about temperature, precipitation, wind speed, air pressure, et cetera, is critically important. And then lower right, we are in another plane of NOAA's, dropping instruments into the Gulf of Mexico to characterize the loop current to try to understand what is likely to happen with respect to where the oil might be transported during the oil spill. So that just gives you a flavor of some of the different things that we were involved in. I also interacted a lot with folks around the country and other venues. On the upper right, I'm with Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, and the Governor of California doing an announcement about removing the Elwha Dam in the state of Washington to, again, make it feasible for salmon to go upstream. Upper left, the President is holding a press conference in the Rose Garden. From the people that are present there, it looks like it was probably on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill topic. And bottom left, I'm giving testimony to the House Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming on climate change and ocean acidification, doing a demonstration of ocean acidification so they could understand what it was all about. And instead of just reading testimony about it or talking verbally about it, I actually did a kind of demo that you would do for a science class to show them what was underway. I interacted with folks from all around the world in various leadership positions, from a wide range of different walks of life. And so it really had an opportunity to see from them how science is used, how it's perceived, how is it portrayed in public understanding, as well as the actual formulation of policy and management. Because NOAA is a science agency, it is looked to as an opportunity for people to learn about the science. Many of these conversations were about climate change, but many were also related issues of how do we manage fisheries in light of climate change? How do we think about how weather patterns are already changing as a result of climate change, et cetera. After I spent my 4 years as the head of NOAA, the President asked me to serve as the first U.S. science envoy for the ocean. And so I connected much more deeply with the leadership in a number of countries in Asia and Africa, the ones that Linda mentioned in her introduction, to really talk about the blue economy, what the opportunities are for using the ocean without using it up, how climate change is already affecting the ocean, how the ocean is actually part of the solution in addressing climate change, both from the standpoint of mitigation but also adaptation. And those also were conversations that were really, really enlightening. So that gives you a sense of some of my background and perspectives as I think about these issues. Climate change is happening every place. Some of the expressions of climate change are more obvious some places than others. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Sea level is rising faster along the mid-Atlantic seaboard than elsewhere in the United States. The waters off New England are warming at a faster rate than they are other places around the U.S. So the changes are not uniform. They are different from one place to another. And so having a global perspective is indeed important, but it's also true that it's the local that people care about. And so we're going to start sort of with the U.S. and then hone in a little more closely on the Pacific Northwest. And then I want to touch on impacts to the ocean, because that's what my colleagues and I spend a lot of time doing. 2018 was the fourth hottest year on record for the globe. The last, did I lose? No, I've got my microphone. I'm getting some feedback here, I think. If I'm sorry, I'm going to stand in front of somebody if I stand. Yep, I need to be away from the speaker. So if I stand here, everybody can see me and I'm not blocking anybody. Okay. So the last 10 of the last years, the last 10 years are the 10 warmest years on record. And it's not that every single year is warmer than the last, but the pattern of warmer and warmer and warmer is very dramatic and is obviously continuing. Not only is the overall average temperature warmer, but indeed we're seeing other expressions of what people are calling global weirding. Not just global warming, but the weather is becoming really, really weird. And it's not weird every year in the same way, it's really variable. So we're seeing greater variability and patterns of change that are different, distinctly different from before. Wildfires are becoming more common as a result of warmer air and more drought. Other events, hurricanes, other extreme weather are happening. And one expression of how it is becoming more extreme is to crunch the numbers, if you will, on the costs to society of that extreme weather. And NOAA keeps records of the number every year, the number of at least $1 billion in damage from some natural catastrophe. It used to be the case that on average there would be 2, maybe 3 disasters that would total at least $1 billion in damage. The number of events has been going up and up. In 2018, we had 14 billion dollar, at least $1 billion weather and climate disasters. So that is just one indicator that things are getting not only more extreme, but more expensive. Now, that number deserves a little bit of scrutiny, because simply calculating the economic damage that was done is not just how much damage was done, because we have more stuff and it's more expensive stuff. So if you think about hurricanes and impacts of hurricanes, there are more hurricanes now, but there are more people to be affected by hurricanes. We have increase in population where more people live on the coast, for example, in the Gulf or the eastern seaboard, and they have more expensive stuff. So there's not a one-to-one correlation, if you will, between the dollar amount and the severity, because it factors in multiple things. If you look at the climate models and project forward, this is a business as usual scenario, and this is running the models out to for a number of decades from now, between 2080 and 2099, so the end of this century. This map shows you the expected total economic damage in percent, that is percent county GDP, the economic damage county by county. So that's what all those little units are, is all the different counties. And it gives you a sense of where in the U.S. the greatest damage is expected that's economic damage. Now that doesn't mean that We here in the Pacific Northwest are getting off lightly because everybody's going to be affected. It just means that some parts of the country are going to get hit in a way that is more expensive. But the message here really is that everybody is going to be hit by something, whether it's floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires, all of those. This gives you a sense of what those 2018 billion-dollar weather and climate disasters were. So the wildfires in Northern California were one of those, but we also had hailstorms with very severe damage in the Rockies, Southwest Plains, very severe drought, etc. So you can see the different icons there. And again, those are weather and climate combined. Some of the weather phenomena are directly tied to climate change. It's like climate change on steroids. I mean, weather on steroids because of climate change. Some of the weather events may not be affected, at least as far as we know, by changes in climate. So this is a compilation of both the weather and the climate disasters. The weather phenomena that we know are directly connected include heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, and floods are all, we expect and are seeing more extreme precipitation events, more droughts, more wildfires, more heat waves. Those, we have a one-to-one correlation, if you want. We understand enough about the physics to say with confidence that these are increasing as a result of climate change. Now, that does not mean that every single extreme event is caused by climate change, because it is not. We had extreme events before we started mucking around with the climate. What we are seeing is more extreme events as a result of climate change. And I think a good analogy is one with baseball. If a baseball player starts taking steroids, his chances of hitting a home run increase. He's going to hit more home runs and bigger home runs. That doesn't mean you can point to any particular home run and say, aha, that home run is because he's taking steroids. But you can point to the pattern of more and bigger as being a result of his taking steroids. And so, as I mentioned earlier, what we are seeing is some types of weather on climate steroids, and that's what we're seeing with these patterns. In the Pacific Northwest, we are seeing in 2015, snowpack was almost 90% below average. Columbia and Snake River sockeye were killed by the warmer waters. We had this thing that scientists called, in very technical language, the warm blob. The warm blob caused an algal bloom that had very serious consequences to and actually closed crab, salmon, and shellfish fisheries. So serious problems for people who make their living from the sea, everybody who enjoys seafood, serious economic consequences as well as social. Wildfires in that year also cost Oregon $560 million. So in that 1 year, we saw a number of events that were seriously problematic for folks in the state. Those of you who experienced all of the smoke in the valley from the wildfires, we actually were surrounded at one point. There was smoke coming up from the south, there was smoke coming down from Canada, there was smoke coming in from the east, and it was just really, really awful. And anybody who had any respiratory problems was quite well aware of that. So the message is that we are already seeing some of these extreme events that are climate related, and we are likely to see them with much greater frequency in the future. That does not mean every single year is going to get incrementally worse. It means we're going to have this flickering back and forth with an overall pattern of more extreme events. This is a figure that shows the areas that are burned from 1984 to 2017 in red. This is forest fire areas, and that gives you a sense of just the overall area that is being affected. And we are definitely seeing increases in the number and severity, the size, the area that's burned, and severity of many of these. So we're seeing impacts throughout the U.S. That differ from one place in the country to another. We're seeing impacts in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. We also are seeing really serious consequences of climate change to the ocean, and I want to segue now to that topic. But begin by saying remind you, as if I need to remind Oregonians, of how important the ocean is to us. It provides a broad suite of benefits that we have taken for granted. Traditionally, going way back in time, oceans have been our grocery stores, our highways, they've been our pharmacies, they've regulated our climate even when we were unaware of it. They've provided medicines. They provide inspiration and information to people. And they have provided insurance against mismanagement of various types of fisheries policies, for example. So in short, the oceans really serve as the life support system for the planet. They are essential to our well-being, and again, we take them for granted. Marine ecosystems provide multiple benefits to us. They include not only the provision of food, people who love to eat seafood, but also the ocean provides half of the oxygen that is on the planet. So look to the ocean when you're taking your breaths, because it's really, really important. It has provided these other benefits to us, including the all-important nutrient cycling, cultural, and spiritual values. The problem is that these overfishing, climate change, pollution, ocean acidification combined are interacting to deplete and disrupt ocean ecosystems, and that has very serious consequences. So climate change is not acting alone. It actually exacerbates some of the other things that are underway. Now, as an aside, we have made very serious strides in ending overfishing in U.S. waters, and that's actually a really, really good news story. We are ending overfishing and rebuilding many of the stocks that have been depleted, and I'm happy to say a little bit more about that because Oregon really has been in the forefront of that. So our federally managed fisheries have really had a major turnaround. Nonetheless, globally, the picture is not a good one. There's still a significant overfishing globally. The ocean does lots of things for us that people are mostly unaware of. It absorbs over 90% of the excess heat on the planet. So climate change would be a heck of a lot worse. We'd all be toasting if the ocean wasn't absorbing most of this heat. So it provides, it's just this huge heat sink. It provides a huge amount of service to us. The other bubbles there show you the amount of heat that is absorbed. The upper right-hand one is the atmosphere. It only absorbs 2.3% of the excess heat. Then the continents, the land, and then the glaciers and ice caps, Arctic sea ice, Greenland ice sheet going down the list there, and then the final one is the Antarctic ice sheet with 0.2%. So that's where the excess heat goes, and most of it is into the ocean. So that's a very important service that the ocean provides for us. The ocean also absorbs about 30% of the carbon dioxide that we emit. So when we burn fossil fuels, that CO2 that is released, a third of it of the CO2 goes into the ocean. So again, it's providing a service. If that CO2 ended up in the atmosphere, it would be making the planet even warmer. So the service is that it's taking it out of the atmosphere. The problem with that is that when the ocean absorbs CO2, the ocean becomes more acidic. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is a benefit to people. This combination of climate change and ocean acidification are really dramatic and are wreaking havoc with a lot of different life in the ocean. We are seeing changes in the ocean that include changes in storm tracks. So storms are doing different things from what they used to. We've seen lots and lots of atmospheric rivers, the Pineapple Expresses, coming in more recently in the last few weeks, aimed squarely at California, not at us, but we've seen atmospheric rivers, Pineapple Expresses, hit us directly. So that's an example of a storm track. Some storm tracks are changing. We're seeing the ocean water is much, much warmer, triggering coral reef bleaching. You've all seen images of corals in the Great Barrier Reef. Massive, gorgeous, super diverse corals that provide this habitat for amazing critters that live there. So because of that warmer water, it's too hot, and those corals are bleaching, and in most cases, dying. Sometimes corals can recover from bleaching, not usually. We're also seeing the ocean, sea level is rising, so the ocean is higher. The ocean is more acidic, as I mentioned, and it is holding less oxygen. It simply holds less oxygen because the water is warmer. And we're seeing more diseases because of the warmer water. So climate change and ocean acidification, both of which are caused by excess CO2, are causing a suite of changes in the ocean. This figure shows you increases in sea level rise. So it has over many, many years, but at the very end here, you can see a very significant, abrupt rise right at the end here. So that's what is problematic. It's not, it is true that there have been changes through time. What is not normal is the rate of change that's happening now. So this sudden escalation is really problematic. The estimates about how much it will rise, for example, by the end of the century, vary considerably because we don't understand a lot of the dynamics having to do with the ice caps and the ice sheets. And so you will see different estimates. The latest are about 1 to 4 feet increase in global average sea level by the end of the century. That would be seriously problematic. Many of our families or friends who live on the East Coast, for example, in Charleston, South Carolina, are seeing, or in various coastal cities, Norfolk, Virginia, for example, are seeing routine flooding. Every time there's a good high tide, their streets are flooded. Their businesses get water. People have to slosh around. So that's already happening, and that's without this additional sea level rise. So this is a serious problem for some parts of our country and in many parts around the world. Not so much a problem for us. And that's partly because the sea level is not rising as much here as it is some places. There's also parts of our coast is still rebounding from glaciers, so there's also the movement of the land, not just the overall sea level rise, and because the shape of our coastline. Densely populated areas and coastal areas are at greater risk, and in many coastal locations, as I mentioned, we're already seeing nuisance flooding now. Currently, already, it is 300 to 900% more frequent than it was 50 years ago. So that gives you a sense of how quickly this has happened and how dramatic it is for some places. So this is a serious problem for some parts of our country. I want to shift now very briefly to ocean acidification. As the ocean is absorbing carbon dioxide, that makes ocean more acidic. Many critters in the ocean use calcium carbonate to build their shells or their skeletons. So think of mussels or oysters or clams or sea stars or lobster or crab or shrimp. Those all have a skeleton that is made in part of calcium carbonate. When the ocean chemistry changes, as it is doing because of ocean acidification, it's harder for those animals to make their skeletons, and they also erode more quickly. So it's harder to make your shell, and it erodes more quickly. This is a shell of a marine snail that floats in the water. It's called a pteropod, Pteropod, pteropod. The common name are sea butterflies. They're really gorgeous little creatures, and they build a shell that is made of calcium carbonate. They're about the size of a lentil bean, and they are a favorite food of salmon. And salmon chow down on pteropods, and they get really fat and healthy when they eat pteropods. Pteropods are seriously affected by ocean acidification. These were pteropods that were in a laboratory under conditions where the ocean was more acidic, like it would be at the end of the century. And you see day 1, all the way day 45, and the shell has pretty much already dissolved by day 45. So this is a problem for pteropods, but it's also a problem for all of the other plants and animals in the ocean that are connected to pteropods, like salmon, because these things are all connected to one another. Ocean acidification in Oregon is also coupled with another phenomenon, hypoxia, which means low oxygen. And we have a situation off the coast of Oregon and Washington where there is deep, deep water that is more acidic because it's older, that is upwelled to the surface. And that upwelled water triggers or exposes creatures both to this more acidic water because it's older, and it has less oxygen, and so it also has more nutrients. So the nutrients trigger an algal bloom. The algae begin to decay, and the bacteria in the water eat the algae and also use up all the oxygen in the water. So when we get a significant upwelling going in the summertime, which is the season of the upwelling, we see both more low oxygen water because the bacteria have already used it all up, and we see more acidic water. So those two problems, both of which are a serious problem for creatures in the ocean, those two problems are coupled off our coast. And the Oregon researchers have figured this out. We've got some really spectacular scientists that have figured out this problem and worked to understand it. We first were aware of the hypoxia, the low oxygen problem, when in 2004 we saw massive numbers of dead Dungeness crabs washed up on our beaches, both sandy beaches and rocky seashores. Many of the crab fishermen were out fishing, and they hauled up their pots, and they were full of dead crabs. And we said, what the heck is going on here? And somebody thought, well, maybe there was a chemical spill. Somebody else had another idea. Nobody had any idea. But fortunately, we had been taking a lot of data and had some buoys out that, as part of the Peace Corps program that I helped start, where we were doing routine monitoring. And we discovered that, in fact, what was happening was that we had the water that was being upwelled was super low in oxygen, super high in nutrients, triggering these algal blooms, the ocean water was just like green pea soup. It was just so thick of algae, and then those algae die, the bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water, and that was killing crabs, and that was killing a lot of fish as well. So that's when we first discovered this. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. This hypoxia, the dead zone, so to speak, has been appearing every year now since that year. Some years it's worse than others. It depends on what's going on. And this upwelling is driven by the coastal winds. So the weather patterns in the Pacific Northwest are particularly conducive to this particular set of circumstances that causes both ocean acidification and hypoxia with some significant consequences. So this schematic is designed to describe what happens. There are winds that are blowing along the shore. So this is the ocean over there. This is land over on my side. And as winds blow along the shore, because the earth is rotating, the surface waters, those blue areas there, are pushed away from the shore. And then that pulls up cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface. So that's this red oxygen minimum zone, low oxygen water that's also older and has is more acidic. That red arrow that's coming up onto the shore here is this low oxygen, nutrient-rich water that is being upwelled to the surface, triggering those green dots, which are supposed to be a phytoplankton bloom. So that's just a schematic of how that works. And what we are seeing is a significant difference in the nature of the upwelling since 2004, in part because there are differences in the temperature between the land and the sea, and that translates into differences in the wind that's driving this upwelling. So we have a physical oceanographic change because of an atmospheric change that is then having all sorts of biological and then ecological and social and economic consequences. And this is all most likely climate related. As a result of this more acidic water, the oyster hatcheries in Oregon, Whiskey Creek, one of them, had noticed one year they had most of their baby oysters died. The spat that they are raising in their tanks that then they sell to all the growers to put out, they had a complete failure of the spat one year. And they couldn't figure out what was happening, so they teamed up with researchers at OSU and figured out what was going on. And what we know now is that the water that they had in their tanks to grow the larvae had been taken from the ocean at a time when there was an upwelling event going on. So it was too acidic, and it affects the young stages more than the adult stages. So the more acidic water killed all of the juvenile oysters. So we figured this problem out. They have a short-term solution, which is now we have a buoy out that is monitoring the acidity in the water, and they draw water for their tanks only when it's okay, when it's not too acidic. So they've figured out a workaround around this, but a number of decades from now, that's not going to do the trick. So this is a short-term fix. So this long-term problem of ocean acidification is very real. The ocean is becoming more acidic every place on the planet. We're just seeing it first here. So we have a window into the future of the ocean because of this upwelling phenomenon that we have off our coast here. The same kind of conditions exist other parts of the world where you see coastal upwelling, for example, off the coast of Chile and Peru. in the Humboldt Current upwelling system, and off the coast of Namibia and South Africa. So those are other places that have similar physical oceanographic conditions, and they too are seeing more intense upwelling that is driven by most likely climate changes, and that more intense upwelling is causing more hypoxia and more acidification. So we have also discovered that there are this global phenomenon of ocean acidification is made worse by the runoff of nutrients from the land and by the absence of vegetation in the water. And so some of the solutions that are local solutions are to have healthy seagrass meadows, because that can ameliorate some of the impacts of ocean acidification, and to reduce the flow of carbon from rivers and streams. So coming off agricultural areas, for example. So better agricultural practices and good healthy seagrass meadows can in fact keep the problem from being as bad as it might be otherwise. So there are interactions here. In addition to the ocean acidification and hypoxia that is a result of the conditions right on the shore, we're seeing more situations where there is less oxygen in the ocean overall, not as a result of upwelling, but just because the ocean is warmer and therefore holds less oxygen. And these are areas in the globe where there are low oxygen areas as a result of just the because the water is warmer. That, again, is a problem for many species. So we're also finally, this is a litany of downers, I'm sorry. There's one final downer, and that is that we are seeing a number of disease things that are surprises that are popping up. We saw serious loss of sea stars, over 20 different species of sea stars in the largest mass mortality event any place, because it was all the way from British Columbia down to Mexico. All of the sea star populations were hit. Only a few survived. Loss of over 90% of the sea stars along the Oregon coast. And we have colleagues in Washington and California that are tracking similar losses. These sea stars play really important roles in their ecosystems, and there is serious concern about what impact this loss is going to have. As it turns out, my husband is one of the people who studies this sea star wasting disease. His name is Bruce Mengi. And they have found that there, in fact, are there were some survivors, and we believe that they are genetically different from the individuals that succumbed to this disease. And we are seeing large numbers of baby sea stars now appear. What their fate will be remains to be seen. This is an ongoing story. But it might not be the end of all of our sea stars, at least the purple and orange ones that you typically see in the intertidal. Rogue Brewery had a conversation with one of our graduate students who said, hey, people would like to know what's going on, and maybe you guys could help and tell the story. So they created a special brew called Wasted Sea Star Purple Pale Ale that was available for a couple of years. It's no longer available. It was actually quite tasty. But that Purple Pale Ale was part of an education campaign to help at least Oregonians understand what was happening. So the purple and orange sea stars, Piesaster, that are in the intertidal are beginning to come back, we think. The sunstar, which is a great big huge sunstar, they're good size, and they typically have multiple arms, 20 or more. They're in the very low intertidal and in the shallow subtidal that's never exposed, and those are not coming back. Those seem to be in serious, serious trouble. So again, this is a surprise. It was new. It's one of the many surprises that we're likely to have. So I've talked about a number of impacts ending up with ones in the ocean. This is really a big problem, and there are lots of challenges that I've identified, but I think there are also some hopeful signs. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of those. I think there's a huge increase, especially in the last few years, in public awareness of climate change as a real legitimate issue and a problem. There's more engagement by more citizens, those of you in the room. We're also seeing more leadership step up to the plate. Leadership from a political leadership. We're seeing businesses. A lot of businesses take this absolutely seriously and want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. The faith community has really made a very significant, very bold statements about this is a moral issue. This is something that we need to address. It is our responsibility as stewards of creation to take care of creation, and because climate change impacts poorest people that are most vulnerable, then we have a moral obligation to our fellow citizens as well as to be good stewards. We're seeing congressional leadership emerge and community and state leadership on this issue. California has been in the vanguard in the United States, not the only state, but certainly in the vanguard, and has shown very dramatically that it is possible to have very significant reductions in carbon emissions while having a very healthy economy. That it's not one versus the other, which was sort of the party line that was touted. We're seeing the economics have changed dramatically. Renewables are now at a scale and a price that makes them the go-to, and that is changing very, very rapidly. We're also seeing legal action. I know that you are involved in one of the court cases. There are a number of court cases, especially that have been filed by kids, one of which is here in Oregon. And there are more and more health concerns. So the combination of politics and activism, economics, and moral responsibility is swirling around and is causing some changes that I think are in the right direction. They're not fast enough, in my view. So these are recent polls done by the Yale Climate Change Communication Center and the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. This is polling that they've done. It starts in 2008 and goes to, in this case, this is 318. Oh, I wish I had the more recent one because it's even more dramatic. Sorry. So this shows that, in fact, there has been an incremental increase. The blue are people who answered the question, how sure are you that global warming is happening? The blue shows those are the people that said, I'm extremely or very sure that global warming is happening. The red is, I am extremely or very sure global warming is not happening. So that in 2018 was down to 7%, and I'm sure or extremely sure was up to 49%. It's even higher now. It's well over 50%. The flip side of that is a majority of registered voters think that global warming is caused by human activities. And so those numbers have been going up as well. So a lot of people are beginning to think that, in fact, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And there's increasing demand on the majority of Americans that are registered voters think that Congress should act to reduce carbon emissions. The House of Representatives has now, Congress has now started having hearings, both the House Science Committee, on which Representative Bonamici serves, and the House Natural Resources Committee are both holding hearings on climate change. And both of them are inviting some really good people to testify. The House Natural Resources Committee has also gone out bold in putting things on its website. This is an invitation to citizens to weigh in and say, climate change impacts me, and to fill out a form and say exactly how climate change is impacting me. They want to hear from citizens. And so this is a call to anybody to please weigh in. You may not be invited to come testify, but we want to hear from you anyway. You've all heard about the new Green Deal, which is getting a lot of publicity. That includes serious attention to climate change, among a number of other things. The nonpartisan descriptions of the concepts in here, not the Green Deal itself, but the concepts in here, have gotten fairly strong support. Senator Wyden is one of the supporters of the new Green Deal. More interestingly is that I think we are seeing a number of either happening or soon to happen mega trends that are game changers. One of those I mentioned has been the price of renewables, and that's just totally changed the dynamic in this country. A lot of it's just that renewables are cheap enough that it's a no-brainer for some parts of the country. Mass market for electric cars in China is just on the verge of exploding. And China is really going big and bold on this, while also building coal-fired power plants, so it's a little schizophrenic, but I think that is going to be a serious game changer. The increased attention to how to build or retrofit buildings so that they are less polluting is also a game changer, and battery storage is really going to be, I think, a major trend to keep an eye on. On the West Coast, there's a lot of action that's underway. There was the 3 West Coast state governors have worked together on climate and ocean issues, and they had a report that looked at hypoxia and ocean acidification. Oregon chaired that panel, but hasn't really done anything about it yet. California participated and then has now its own ocean acidification and hypoxia action plan. So that seems to be an opportunity for Oregon. You may know that crab fishermen have sued now a number of fossil fuel companies because of their losses to their businesses because of the warmer waters. So there's new action on that front. I actually, in 2003, 2005, I co-chaired Governor Kulingowski's advisory group on global warming, along with the CEO of Northwest Natural. And we made some big, bold recommendations. This committee did big, bold recommendations that have mostly, for the most part, not gone, a lot of good talk, but not enough action, I guess I would say. And in fact, Oregon is not expected to meet its 2020 or its 2050 goals for reducing emissions. We sort of set goals, but we're not on track to meet them. The new cap and trade bill that's been introduced in fact, presents an opportunity for the state to become the second state to have a cap and trade system along with California. And that's an active discussion that is underway now. And there are a lot of voices weighing in on that. A number of scientists have recently pulled together a letter that will go to the governor and to state legislators and be printed as an ad in newspapers that urges them to pass a strong climate policy in 2019, to cap and price carbon emissions, to invest funds in Oregon communities to support clean energy jobs and climate resilience, and to put the state on the path to meet its emission reduction goals. So that's just for your information. And then off Oregon, we have a series of marine reserves, which are fully protected from any extractive activity. These little reserves are a good example of what's happening globally with an increased attention to creating safe havens for wildlife that we're also discovering, if they are big enough, have very significant potential to bring benefit to both sequestering carbon as well as ameliorating some of the worst impacts of climate change to the ocean by providing some safe havens. So I think there is encouraging progress. I think things are underway. They are not at the speed they need to. And so that really, I think, is worth thinking about how to escalate those. I would note that we had a narrative about climate change that went something like, climate action will be costly and undermine growth. And people thought that was true and said, okay, we need to do it anyway. But now that narrative has flipped. That narrative is now, smart climate action can promote jobs and prosperity. And this was articulated not only by Sir Nicholas Stern, but also Felipe Calderon, and that report, the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, might be a useful resource. So there are a lot of things that individuals can do. Many of you are already active in this space, but reducing your own carbon, water, and plastic footprints, choosing sustainable seafood, eating lower on the food web. You know, the more meat you eat, the less good it is for the planet compared to plant foods. Communicating with elected representatives, running for office. But one thing we've discovered recently is that a lot of groups are talking about climate change, but they don't necessarily, as individuals, talk to their neighbors or talk to other people. And just talking about it, I think, is important. So I would close by saying thank you to you for what you do. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit with you, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time. Thank you.
I need you to use this so I can this.
Testing, testing. Can everybody hear me? Are we good? Thank you so much. I am humbled by your presence. As the daughter of a commercial fisherman and a Northwest sailor, I have depended on NOAA science to keep me safe, and I just so appreciate the work that both you and your husband have done on behalf of Oregon and behalf of the world, really. You answered my first question, which is what can we do individually, each of us, to move this along faster, because it seems like time really is running out. And I have a question about plastics pollution. Can you I know that's a whole topic of itself, but give us some ideas about what we can do in terms of ocean and plastics pollution.
So the question is oceans and plastic pollution. I know her mic was cutting in and out. Many of you have seen the really gross, awful pictures of this massive amount of plastic pollution, and it's a very real thing. This is one of the surprises. You know, people just didn't sort of think about how bad it could get, and it got really bad really fast. So it is a problem. We don't know what all the consequences of it are. We know that it can't be good, but I like to think about it in sort of three buckets. One bucket is there are attempts to clean up what's out there. That's actually a hard thing to do because the ocean is a really big place and a lot of the stuff is super teensy tiny. So many of the pictures that you've seen have been in coastal areas where it would be actually possible to collect some stuff. Most of the stuff that's already out there that is in the ocean way far away from land is really hard to collect. So we can make inroads in collecting some of it. We probably can't collect all of it. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is keeping it from flowing from the land to the ocean. And we know from the work of a number of scientists that most of the plastics that's in the ocean is coming from a handful of countries in Southeast Asia that have a total disposable society and have totally dysfunctional sewage and garbage treatment. So keeping it from going from the land to the sea is sort of the second bucket. That's a lot more tractable, not easy. There are people that are working on that. And there is intense interest in the part of those countries now that they've sort of been shamed in trying to get ahead of this. Indonesia has gone big and bold and made some good promises on this front. The third bucket, which is the ultimate solution, is to really have a circular economy mindset so that the way we are making plastics is different and it's made of different stuff that in fact can be recycled, can be broken down, can be reused. So I think there's no one simple solution. I think we have to think in each of those three buckets. And I can tell you there is a lot of interest and a lot of action, not a lot of action yet, a lot of interest in fixing this problem. And this is another one where, there are lots of challenges that are out there, and this is a big one, and it sort of caught us by surprise. In the end, if we fix a lot of these ocean problems, we're actually going to be fixing ourselves too. So individuals, there's a lot of attention now for single-use plastics. There's no reason to be having plastic straws served routinely. I travel with my stainless steel straw with a little thing to clean it out. So, I travel, it's in my backpack. I'll show it to you. So plastic straws are just the tip of the iceberg. That's an easier one to deal with. There's a lot of other plastic stuff. So I think they're getting rid of plastic bags is an easy thing to do. Most of you probably use cloth bags now when you do your shopping. That's good. And there are things that cities and counties can do on that front. So it's the single-use plastics is the most obvious thing to tackle, and that's a good start.
Thank you for your work, and thank you for speaking with us today. You mentioned that the sea stars went through a rapid natural selection, and that there's a genetic offset that is going to hopefully maintain their presence on the planet. I know Hawaii is growing corals on land to reintroduce into the sea. Is there any work being done on rapid natural selection to withstand climate change with corals?
That's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up. A number of my colleagues are working on this very topic, and as it turns out, there is a lot of genetic variability in coral, even within many species have genetic variability, and not all genotypes are equally susceptible to warmer waters. And what they are discovering is that there are some places, for example, on reef flats that routinely get really, really warm because they're shallow and the sun is heating them up, that don't bleach, even at temperatures that for their neighbors would be problematic. So people are cultivating those. They've identified what the genes are that are responsible. And one of the lines of attack seems to be to protect those genotypes, for example, through a marine protected area that's fully protected, so that we can preserve as much of those genotypes as possible, with the idea of perhaps later transplanting them elsewhere. Doing some assisted migration is the jargon term for that. There's also interest, and there are other scientists that are actively trying to grow those genotypes in labs with the idea of outplanting them. So cross your fingers that we can actually make it through, what has been set in motion is increased warming. So that's a problem. And I think the hope is that if we reduce emissions, then, and at the same time, if we can, find the genotypes that are going to survive, then there is hope that when the ocean has been stabilized, we can actually be outplanting some of these more resistant genotypes. That doesn't mean we're out of the woods. It just means it's not hopeless, and it's worth trying to reduce emissions now as fast as possible while also doing these other things.
I have a question that's a little off topic, but you might be able to answer it better than anybody else I know. There was a disturbing article in the New Yorker a while back about the new Commerce Secretary being a person who is involved in the AccuWeather company, and it was kind of frightening, the implications of that. Are you familiar with that, and are you willing, or is it something you'd talk about?
So here are the facts. The Commerce Secretary does have his problems and has been accused of a number of things, but that's different from what you were talking about. And the Commerce Secretary he's in charge of the Department of Commerce. NOAA is one of the agencies within the Department of Commerce. The position that I held was the head of NOAA. The President Trump has nominated an individual to be the head of NOAA, the position I had. That individual used to be the CEO of AccuWeather. And he has a track record of trying to keep NOAA from issuing weather forecasts and weather warnings because he wants the private weather enterprise like AccuWeather to be able to make money doing that. And so he had worked with Rick Santorum a number of years ago to introduce legislation to actually do exactly that thing. So it's not just a matter of somebody thinking he's doing something, he's actually acted on that. So that is, that's a problem. He also, AccuWeather is a private company, it's family owned. Until recently, he continued to be the CEO, and he said in his confirmation hearing he would simply resign from the company and then he wouldn't have a conflict. But in reality, his brother runs the company, his wife works for the company, the whole family works for the company. And so many people have pointed out that even if he does resign, which he actually has now done about a few weeks ago, he did resign as CEO. But people have argued that, in fact, there's still a conflict because, if he would be in a position of power as administrator to influence business that would go AccuWeather's way or constrain what NOAA could do. So it's a serious conflicts. I have publicly said a number of times I don't think that he's appropriate for NOAA administrator. He was not confirmed the first year he was nominated by the president. He was not confirmed the second year he was nominated by the president. You have to do a re-nomination every year if the clock runs out. He's now been nominated for a third time by President Trump. And just in the last 2 weeks, AccuWeather has been accused of a lot of sexual harassment in their company during the time he was CEO. And they have settled out of court for a very sizable amount of money. So there's a new scandal now that's kind of in the mix with this. So that's the lowdown that are public facts about what's going on.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time. We have a little gift.